Cullen Roche is with us. He's a CIO at Disciplined Funds, a man who had been calling for a deep cut and action from the Fed to catch up. So you're not surprised by this based on our last few conversations, Cullen?
Well, I'm actually surprised
that they actually did it
through with it.
But you're arguing fundamentally they should.
Yeah, this is what I would have done. So I'm kind of proud of Powell. I mean, in the sense that this is actually a really interesting move because they're thinking in a very proactive sense. And I think to some degree, they're sort of admitting, hey, we made a mistake in July. Because if you remember after the July meeting and then the August employment report, everybody kind of panicked when the employment report came in weaker than expected. And everybody came out and said, oh, crap, they should have cut in July. And I think the Fed felt that. And so to some degree, this is them fessing up to, hey, we should have cut in July. This is our makeup. And now nobody can say we're behind the curve here.
Now, what do you think kind of response makes sense? Stocks are in the middle of a battle right now. Bonds have actually picked a direction, it seems, because they rallied big and then they just faded even bigger. Take me through that one, Cullen, because that's the one I think is most interesting.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there with this reduces the risk of a hard landing now because the Fed now is looking more and more proactive. So they're in the position where if the economy does start to weaken substantially, they can be a little bit ahead of the curve. They can start to either move bigger or they can move, at a faster pace. So economic wise, this is good for risk assets because it reduces the risk that they're way behind the curve. For the bond market, it's more interesting because I think that a lot of this compresses the attractiveness of the yield curve in a way that the short end becomes less attractive, obviously, because they're now starting to cut rates. So 1-year T-bills are down to 4%. And the long end had priced in a lot of this. So the long end had rallied, 10% or so in the last, 3 or 4 months here. And so it kind of compresses a lot of the attractiveness across the yield curve to the point where, I've been sort of saying that like the 5-year is sort of like it's the sort of the optimal point on the curve where you're taking more risk than say a treasury bill, but you're not reaching way out to like a 30-year where you expose yourself to this sort of whipsaw where let's say inflation does kind of tick back, or let's say the next few labor reports are a little stronger than expected. You could get now the pace of cuts. We're definitely transitioning into a cut cycle, but if you get stronger than expected economic readings in the next 3 to 4 months, the pace of cuts is going to slow, which means you're going to get a little bit of a whipsaw effect in interest rates higher.
Love that. Well said. The whipsaw, the circularity of duration, right? You do things now that have an effect later on. And that's kind of the concept of the curve. If we could go with the 30-year minus 2-year, not a typical curve we look at. But if we're going to pull that up, Cullen, because this thing is like going astronomic. And I think it's a fun one to look at. You mentioned the 5s, which is not like the most closely watched one, but I like the point about these certain sections of duration that are doing really interesting things. Like the 30s and the 2s right now is just blowing way out. Because the further out you're going, it's like, to your point, maybe this plane just keeps on flying. Maybe the plane takes back off again.
Yeah, so I don't think that's a high probability. Like I think this meeting is definitely going to bring up a lot of talk about, Arthur Burns, repeat of the mistake of the 1970s. I've been saying this for, I'm a broken record on this for the last 18 months. I do not see the 1970s repeat. I also don't see the economic boom scenario though. So, I think that this is interesting in that it compresses everything into this sort of, middle part of the curve where you don't get a lot of reward for reaching for risk really in either direction. So, it's a boring narrative, but I'm still sort of in this view that the economy is going to continue to grow in this baseline scenario is like a 2.5%-ish sort of, pre-COVID basically. I actually thought the most interesting thing from the presser was that Powell said that the neutral rate he thinks is much higher than COVID, which I don't see that. I've sort of been in this camp where I think everything's sort of just mean reverting back to where we were pre-COVID. And I still have that same view. I don't think the neutral rate is higher. I think the Fed ultimately ends up back at an interest rate of something probably in the 3% range. And the interesting thing about navigating that is how fast do we get there? Do we get there quickly because the economy is slower than expected, or does the Fed move at this very gradual pace? And I think the baseline expectation should be that they're going to move at a very gradual pace over the next 18 months to get us to something like 3%.
That would kind of argue then against your kind of return to like pre-COVID, like kind of not ZERP-ish, but like in that direction, right? Because if they're going to move slowly, that kind of more argues that we're going to mean revert to like pre-GFC, like that,
Yeah.
you know, we will have some of this sticking around for a bit.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean that we're going to return to 0% interest rates.
Yeah.
In fact,
I'm
I think
directionally.
Directionally, yeah. I think in terms of like in the rate of inflation primarily and the rate of economic growth, we're returning back. Everything's kind of mean reverting back to where we were pre-COVID, more or less. And so, but in terms of ZERP, I mean, I think one of the lessons from the last 10 years is that maybe ZERP was a terrible idea, and
100%.
that we should never go back to something like that,
100%.
because you get this sort of extreme whipsaw effect then where, you know, they're cutting to 0 and then they're raising to 5 really quickly when it looks like they're behind the curve. So I don't know. I mean, I'm a big advocate of, I mean, if it was me running the Fed, I would stand up and fire myself and put a computer in charge, and I would probably set like a threshold where the lower bound of rates could never go below 2 and never above 5. And
I like it.
because typically, once you're at 0 or you're above 5, it means that something else is really wrong in the economy. Interest rates aren't enough to get you to where you need to be. And so that's sort of a signal to me. When you're in a ZERP scenario, or a scenario where the Fed thinks they need to be in a ZERP scenario, it means that somebody else needs to step in. You probably need fiscal policy or some other sort of policy to be carrying the heavy buckets there. So
Great point.
The lesson here from the last 10 years, I think, is that ZERP should probably never come back.
No, it's a really terrific point that when you're down there, the utility kind of then flips in terms of like stimulative or restrictive. Like I think we know
you have a diminishing return,
Exactly.
I think, on both sides, and you get this in hyperinflations too, where you see central
Correct.
banks trying to fight interest rates in hyperinflations with, like, you know, raising interest rates to 25 or 30 or 40%. Meanwhile, you know, the central government is still printing tons of money in a lot of these cases. And it's like, hello, you know, you fiscal policy needs to step in and, you know, step back in a hyperinflation and stop printing money and things like that. And so, you know, there's limits to how effective these things are. But I think one of the big takeaways from today, though, is that Powell is doing a really, like, surprisingly great job and deserves a huge amount of credit. He's thinking in a very proactive sense here, which I think everybody should applaud, because he's thinking proactively rather than the traditional form that the Fed operates under, is that they're highly reactive and they're almost always behind the curve. And the Powell Fed so far, although they were probably behind the curve in 2021 raising rates, they look like they're being proactive. So, you know, kudos to them.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too. It's just the evidence skews very positively towards Powell for now, and it continues to be that way. And on the subject of just having the Fed funds be the lever that determines policy, you know, I kind of like your idea of maybe setting some thresholds, but also I think one of the things we've learned here that I've thought for a while is by Powell introducing sort of a surprise event, he's created some distance. He's added a little opacity to what's been super transparent, and I kind of like that. The fact that before that journal article, market did not think he was going 50, and he put the word out, I'm going.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's refreshing, really, to see. I mean, he's taking this sort of outside the box thinking. I often talk about, you know, managing the Fed more like the way that a trader would think about the financial markets, and taking cues from the bond market. And the bond market, obviously, in the last month or so has been sending a really strong signal that, hey, you should go 50, or we think you should go 50. And so, you know, he confirmed a lot of that. He's thinking a little bit like a trader and hedging bets here without being irrational either. I mean, that's another good takeaway from this, is that, you know, where the effective Fed funds rate tomorrow morning is going to be 4.8%, which is in an environment where inflation is still 2.5% to 3%, depending on which, you know, metric you prefer to look at. That's still a restrictive rate. So this isn't like a scenario where they've gone from 5 to 0 overnight and they're going to like stimulate some sort of huge credit binge or something. It's still going to be very hard to get a mortgage for most people. It's still loans are still going to be tight across the board for the most part. So, they're taking baby steps, but at the same time, he's put himself in a position where he can at least start to get a little bit ahead of the curve if these labor reports continue to come in weaker than expected in the next few quarters.
There it is. All right. Thanks, Cullen. Fantastic analysis. Like the take on both the policy and the man behind the wheel. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Oliver. Have a good one.